The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, carried by a boy whose boots were caked in the mud of 3 counties, and it was placed upon a silver tray in the receiving hall of Ashkam Hall, as though it were no more than an invitation to supper. No one in that house yet understood what it would undo. The seal was plain, unmarked by any house of consequence, and it was for this reason alone that the butler nearly set it aside unopened. But something in the weight of the paper, in the faint smell of tanned hide that clung to its folds, made him pause. He carried it instead to the study, where the Duke of Ashkam sat before a cold hearth, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on nothing at all. "That Tannery's been dead for years," the Duke said, before the letter was even placed before him. He did not need to read the address to know where it had come from. Milbrook, the name alone, was enough to darken his expression, to draw his shoulders into that particular stillness that his household had learned, over many winters, to fear more than any shout. The tannery at Milbrook had not turned a profit since before his father's death. Its vats stood empty, its sheds collapsing under ivy and neglect, its name spoken only by old men in the village who remembered when the scent of curing leather had drifted for miles on a west wind. It was, by every reasonable account, a ruin. And yet the letter sat there upon his desk, waiting, as if it disagreed. He did not open it that morning. He would not open it for 3 more days, though he did not yet know that when he finally did, the words within would set in motion a chain of events that no ledger, no title, and no inherited certainty could stop. By the time the first snow fell that winter, soldiers of his own regiment would march in coats lined with leather, bearing a mark he did not recognize, a mark that would, in time, lead him back to a name he had tried very hard to forget. But that is getting ahead of the story. Because before there was a letter, before there was a duke staring into a cold hearth, there was a young woman standing in the wreckage of everything her family had once been, not knowing that the very thing everyone told her was worthless, a dead tannery, a forgotten trade, a name no one respected anymore, would become the instrument of her survival and, in the end, of her justice. Before we go further into her story, if tales like this one, of quiet women who rebuild what powerful men have discarded, of secrets buried in old English estates, of letters that arrive to undo a lifetime of certainty, are the kind of story that keeps you watching until the very last word, then take a moment now to subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next one. And I would love to know, in the comments below, where in the world you are watching from tonight. Whether it is a quiet evening in London, a late night in Manila, an early morning in Toronto, or anywhere else this story has found you. Write it below. It means more than you know to see where these old English tales travel. Now, let us return to Milbrook and to the young woman who did not yet understand what she carried. Her name was Eleanor Vane, and in the spring of that year she was 23 years old, standing in a doorway that no longer had a door, looking out at what remained of her father's tannery. The building had not been touched by any hand of care in nearly 4 years. The great curing vats, once the pride of 3 counties, sat filled with rainwater and rot. The roof beams sagged like the ribs of some starved animal. And yet Eleanor did not look away from it the way the villagers did when they passed. She looked at it the way one looks at a grave that has not yet been properly mourned. Her father, Josiah Vane, had been the finest tanner in the county, a man whose leather had once clothed the boots of officers and the gloves of ladies who never knew whose hands had shaped the hide they wore. He had built his trade from nothing, and for a time the Vane name had meant something. But 4 years prior, in a single terrible season, everything had unravelled. A fire had taken half the tannery, a rival house had undercut every contract he held, and then, most devastating of all, a debt he swore he had never signed for had appeared in the county ledgers, bearing his signature, drowning what remained of the family in obligations they could not pay. Within a year, Josiah Vane was dead. The physician called it a failure of the heart, though those who loved him knew it was something closer to a failure of the world, to be fair to him. And Eleanor was left with her mother, a modest cottage, and a name that had become, in the eyes of polite society, a byword for ruin. She had not been raised for poverty. She remembered, faintly now, the years when the Vane household had employed a cook and a girl for the linens, when her mother had worn gowns ordered from London, when her father had returned each evening smelling of oak bark and pride. She remembered, too, the moment that life ended, not with a single dramatic collapse, but with a slow, grinding erosion, the kind that takes a family's dignity one small humiliation at a time. The creditors who no longer removed their hats when they called, the neighbours who found sudden reasons not to visit. The invitations that stopped arriving, quietly, without explanation, until the silence itself became the explanation. By the time she was 20, Eleanor understood a truth that few gently raised young women of her age were ever forced to learn, that respectability was not a birthright, but a possession, and possessions could be taken. She had watched her mother's health decline under the weight of shame more than illness, had watched the fine china sold piece by piece to pay for coal, had learned to mend her own gowns rather than admit she could not afford new ones. And through it all, she had watched the tannery, her father's life's work, sit abandoned at the edge of the village, its silence louder than any accusation. She did not yet understand why she could not simply let it go. Other daughters of ruined men had done so. They had married quickly, married beneath what they once might have hoped for, or married not at all and faded into the quiet servitude of unmarried aunts in other people's households. Eleanor had received 2 such offers herself in the past year, both from men who made it clear, in the careful cruelty of their compliments, that they were doing her a considerable favour by overlooking her family's disgrace. She had refused them both, and her mother, in her weaker moments, had wept at the refusal, certain that pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. But Eleanor was not refusing out of pride alone. There was something else, something she could not yet name, that kept drawing her back to the ruined tannery at the edge of the village, to stand in its doorway and look at the ghost of what her father had built. She did not yet understand that the answer to her family's ruin was buried not in a marriage, not in charity, but in the very walls she had been taught to see as worthless. What remained hidden in that tannery was far more valuable than anyone, including Eleanor herself, yet knew. It was on one such evening, standing in that doorway with the last light going gold and then grey across the broken beams, that she first heard the name of the Duke of Ashkam spoken in connection with her father's old trade. It was old Mrs. Hattersley, the miller's widow, who mentioned it in passing, the way one mentions old gossip that has long since lost its sting. "Your father did work for the old Duke once, you know," she said, not looking up from her mending. "Before your time, dear, before all this trouble. Some contract for the regiment, I believe. Never came to much, from what I heard. But he was proud of it. Talked about it for years." Eleanor had never heard her father speak of any such contract. And in the small, cold part of her mind that had learned, through hardship, to notice when something did not fit, the same part of her mind that would later save her, she filed the comment away, not knowing yet that it was the first thread of a much larger and more dangerous truth. No one in the village spoke of it again, but she did not forget it. It was 3 weeks later that the second thread appeared, though at the time it seemed no more than an ordinary misfortune. The cottage she shared with her mother, already mortgaged twice over against her father's old debts, was to be seized. The notice came not from a stranger, but from a man Eleanor had once considered a family friend, her father's former solicitor, a Mr. Pemberton, who delivered the news with an apologetic softness that did nothing to soften its weight. There was, he explained, no more time, no more extensions to be granted. Within the month, mother and daughter would need to vacate, and there was, as far as he could see, no lawful means of preventing it. It was in the depth of that despair, staring at a future with nowhere fixed in it, that Eleanor made the decision that would change everything, though she could not have known it then. She would not go begging to relatives who had already made their disdain plain. She would not accept a third proposal of marriage, offered as charity dressed in courtship's clothing. Instead, she walked, alone and unannounced, the 4 miles to Ashkam Hall, carrying with her the one thing she still possessed that no creditor had thought to claim, her father's old ledgers, rescued from the fire, half burned at the edges but still legible, still bearing his careful hand. She did not go to beg. She went to ask a single question, whether the old Duke's household had in fact once contracted with her father, and whether any record of that arrangement might explain the debts that had destroyed him. She did not expect an answer. She certainly did not expect what she found instead, a house in nearly as much quiet ruin as her own fortunes, and a son. The new Duke, cold-eyed and unwelcoming, who looked at her not as a supplicant to be dismissed, but as a puzzle he had not asked to be given, and did not yet wish to solve. She did not yet understand that his coldness was not cruelty but caution, born of his own losses. And she did not yet understand that the moment she stepped through the gates of Ashkam Hall, she had set herself on a path that would take her not away from her father's ruined trade, but directly back into its heart, into the very tannery at Milbrook that everyone, including the Duke himself, insisted had been dead for years. Ashkam Hall, when Eleanor first saw it properly, in the fading light of that long walk, was not the grand and gleaming seat of nobility that its name suggested from a distance. Up close, its grandness was worn thin in places, like a coat turned too many winters, ivy climbing unchecked along the east wing, several windows shuttered and dark, a fountain in the front court that had not run water in what looked like years. It was, she realized, with a small and unexpected pang of recognition, a house keeping its own secrets of decline, much as her family had once tried and failed to keep theirs. She was received, eventually, not by the Duke himself but by his steward, a narrow, watchful man named Mr. Reeve, who studied her ledgers with an expression she could not quite read, something between irritation and alarm, before informing her, in clipped tones, that His Grace did not concern himself with matters so many years settled, and that she would do better to take her grievances elsewhere. It was only as she turned to leave, her hope collapsing quietly inside her, that the Duke himself appeared in the hall, drawn, she would later learn, by nothing more than curiosity at the sound of an unfamiliar voice in his house. He was younger than she had expected, though there was little youth left in his bearing. Alaric Thorne, 7th Duke of Ashkam, had inherited his title only 2 years prior, under circumstances the village still discussed in careful whispers. His elder brother dead in a hunting accident that some called too convenient to be accidental, his father gone the following winter. Some said of grief, others said of something closer to guilt. He carried himself now with the particular rigidity of a man who trusted almost nothing, least of all sentiment, and he looked at Eleanor Vane's burned ledgers with open skepticism. "That Tannery's been dead for years," he said, the very words he would later say again, to a letter he had not yet received, as though the phrase had become a kind of shield he raised whenever Milbrook was mentioned. "Whatever contract you believe existed between your father and my father's household, I assure you, it ended long before either of us had reason to care about it." But Eleanor, standing in that grand and quietly decaying hall, with nothing left to lose, did not retreat as Mr. Reeve clearly expected her to. She opened the ledger to a page half consumed by fire, where her father's handwriting recorded, in the meticulous detail of a craftsman proud of his work, a contract for leather, boots, belts, harness straps, commissioned for a regiment her father never named in full, paid for in installments that stopped, abruptly, in the very season the fire took half his workshop. "I do not ask you to honour a debt, Your Grace," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I ask only whether you know why the payments stopped, and why, 3 months later, a debt my father never signed appeared against his name." It was a small thing, that question, but she did not yet understand that it was a thread which, once pulled, would begin to unravel a deception that reached far beyond her father's ruined workshop, a deception that touched the Duke's own household, his own steward, and a secret his family had buried more carefully than any grave. The Duke did not answer her that evening. He simply studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies a debt he suspects he may, after all, owe. What remained hidden behind that silence was far more dangerous than either of them yet knew. He did not send her away that night, though he did not welcome her either. He instructed Mr. Reeve, with visible reluctance, to have the household ledgers from his father's time located and reviewed, a task Mr. Reeve accepted with a stiffness that Eleanor, watching closely as she had learned to do in 4 years of hardship, found curious. A man with nothing to hide does not flinch at the word ledger. She said nothing of this observation. She only walked the 4 miles home in the dark, her mind turning over every detail, and did not yet know that she had, without intending it, begun to frighten a man far more dangerous than any duke. The weeks that followed brought no immediate answers, only a slow and uneasy correspondence between Milbrook and Ashkam Hall. The Duke, true to his word, had the old ledgers searched, and true to the pattern of everything else in that great declining house, they were found incomplete, pages missing, entries crossed through in a hand that did not match his father's. Sums altered in ink slightly darker than the rest. It was Eleanor, invited back, grudgingly, and only after her mother's eviction notice forced the matter to urgency, who first noticed that the missing pages corresponded exactly to the months her father's contract had ceased. No one in the house spoke of it directly, but the silence around it had changed in quality, from indifference to something closer to concern. It was during this period that Eleanor was permitted, under Mr. Reeve's visibly unhappy supervision, to examine the estate's older records stored in a locked room above the old counting house, a room that had not, by the dust upon its door, been opened in a very long time. It was there, among crumbling account books and forgotten correspondence, that she found the first true clue, a letter, unsigned, addressed to the previous Duke, referencing a necessary adjustment to the Milbrook accounts, and a payment made not to Josiah Vane, but to a solicitor whose name she recognised at once. Mr. Pemberton, the very man who had, only weeks before, informed her so apologetically that her family's cottage could no longer be saved. She did not yet understand the full shape of what she had found, but she understood enough to know that the ruin of her family had not been an accident of misfortune, as she had believed for 4 long years, but the result of a deliberate hand, and that the hand belonged, in some fashion she could not yet prove, to a man she had trusted, and perhaps to a household far grander than her own. She said nothing to the Duke that day. She was not yet certain enough, and she had learned, in her years of quiet suffering, the danger of accusing a powerful man without proof. Instead, she returned to Milbrook, to the ruined shell of her father's tannery, and began, for the first time in 4 years, to walk its collapsed sheds, not with grief, but with purpose. If the truth of her father's ruin lay buried somewhere in these walls, she intended to find it before anyone could bury it further. There were other mysteries too, in those early days at Milbrook, smaller ones, the kind that seemed insignificant on their own, but which Eleanor, in her father's careful habit of noticing, refused to dismiss. There was the matter of the old gardener, Tobias, who had worked the grounds of Ashkam Hall since before the current Duke was born, and who grew strangely quiet whenever the name Vane was mentioned in his hearing. She caught him once, in the half-light of a Milbrook evening, standing at the edge of the tannery yard as though he had walked there out of habit rather than purpose, staring at the collapsed curing shed with an expression she could not read, grief, perhaps, or guilt, or something closer to both. When she approached him, he startled as though caught at something forbidden, and offered only that he had known her father once, long ago, and that some houses carry their sins in the walls, miss, whether the family living in them knows it or not. He would say no more, no matter how gently she pressed him, and for weeks afterward she wondered what exactly the old man had witnessed in the years before her birth, and why he seemed so reluctant to speak of it even now. There was also the strange matter of the portrait. In the long gallery of Ashkam Hall, among the solemn painted faces of dukes, long dead, hung a likeness of the previous duke's steward, not Whitfield, not the man who called himself Reeve, but the steward before him, a figure Eleanor had never heard named aloud in the household. The portrait had been turned to face the wall, its frame thick with undisturbed dust, as though someone had wished it removed entirely, but had not quite found the courage, or the cause, to take it down. When she asked Mr. Reeve about it, carefully, without revealing how much she had already begun to suspect, he claimed not to know the man's name at all, a claim so smoothly delivered that she felt certain, even then, that it was a lie. She did not yet understand why a house so proud of its lineage would hide a single face among so many others. She would not understand it fully until much later, when she learned that the man in that turned portrait was the very steward Whitfield had once served beneath and had, in some manner never fully recorded, helped destroy. And there was the matter of the letters her own mother had kept, hidden for years in a small tin box beneath a floorboard in the cottage parlour, which Eleanor discovered quite by accident while packing their remaining possessions in the days before the eviction. They were letters from her father, written not to her mother, but to a man whose name meant nothing to Eleanor at the time, a name that would later prove to belong to the vanished steward himself, back when he still used it honestly. In them, her father wrote with evident warmth of a partnership he believed would secure his family's future for generations, of a duke's household that had promised him more than mere payment for his craft, a share in its profit, a name remembered alongside the estate's own. Reading them, Eleanor understood for the first time the full weight of what had been taken from her father, not merely his workshop, not merely his good name, but the future he had so carefully begun to build, stolen from him in the space of a single terrible season by a man he had trusted as a friend. She did not yet understand how all these small mysteries, the gardener's silence, the turned portrait, her mother's hidden letters, would eventually weave into a single thread. But she kept each one carefully, the way her father had once kept his ledgers, trusting that patience, applied with enough care, would eventually reveal the whole cloth from which they had all been cut. What she found, over the following days, changed the shape of everything. Beneath the floor of the old curing shed, a space her father had always kept locked, and which she had never, in her girlhood, been permitted to enter, she discovered a second set of ledgers, hidden beneath a loose board, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from damp. They were not the burned records she had carried to Ashkam Hall. They were complete, careful, and damning. In them, her father had recorded not only his contract with the old Duke's regiment, but a private arrangement, a partnership, in his own precise words, with the Duke's household, in which Josiah Vane's superior tanning process, a method of curing leather that made it both stronger and more supple than any rivals, was to be used exclusively for the estate's own military contracts, in exchange for a share of the profits that would have made the Vane family, in time, genuinely wealthy. It was this partnership, this promise of future prosperity, that had made her father's tannery a target. Someone, and the ledgers suggested strongly that it was the previous Duke's steward, a man who had held the position before Mr. Reeve and who had since vanished from the county entirely, had seen an opportunity to seize the process for himself, to claim the profit without honouring the partnership, and had engineered both the fire that crippled the tannery and the false debt that destroyed Josiah Vane's reputation, ensuring he would not live to contest the theft. She did not yet understand how deeply Mr. Pemberton was entangled in the scheme, nor how close it reached to the current Duke himself. But she understood, holding those hidden ledgers in trembling hands, that her father had not failed. He had been robbed. And the process he had died protecting, the very method by which Vane leather had been stronger, finer, more enduring than any other in the county, was recorded there in his own hand, waiting, all this time, to be reclaimed. Years later, when the truth of that winter was spoken of in the village, people would say that it was this discovery, more than any other, that changed Eleanor Vane. Not because it proved her father innocent, though it did, but because it gave her, for the first time since his death, something to build rather than something to mourn. She returned to Ashkam Hall not as a supplicant this time, but as a woman in possession of a truth the Duke did not yet know he needed. And it was there, in the cold study where he had once dismissed her father's tannery as a thing long dead, that the second and far more dangerous act of this story began. For the moment she laid her father's hidden ledgers upon his desk. The Duke of Ashcombe was forced to confront a truth about his own household that he had spent 2 years trying very hard not to see. The Duke did not react at once. He read the ledgers in a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the fire settling in the grate, could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. When at last he looked up, something in his cold composure had cracked, just slightly, at the edges, not into warmth, not yet, but into a wariness she recognized, because she had worn it herself for 4 long years. It was the look of a man realizing the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had believed. "My father never mentioned a partnership," he said finally, and there was something almost accusatory in it, as though Eleanor herself had invented the injustice simply by uncovering it. "Your father may not have known the full extent of it," Eleanor replied, carefully, for she had already begun to suspect, though she did not yet say so aloud, that the old Duke had been as much a victim of his steward's deception as her own father had been. But someone in this household did. And that same someone, I believe, is still very much alive and still very much interested in ensuring the truth stays buried. It was a bold thing to say to a man who held, in every practical sense, power over her family's remaining fortunes. But Eleanor Vane had learned something in 4 years of ruin that grander women, protected by wealth and title, rarely had cause to learn, that fear, once you have survived its worst, loses much of its power over you. She did not yet know that this same boldness, this refusal to soften the truth for the comfort of powerful men, would, in time, be the very quality that earned her not only the Duke's reluctant respect, but something closer to trust. He gave her, that day, something she had not expected. Permission. Permission to investigate the old contracts fully, to search whatever remained of his father's records, to pursue the matter of Mr. Pemberton and the vanished steward with whatever resources the estate could quietly provide, so long as the matter was handled, his words, without scandal, and without the county learning that Ashkam Hall's own affairs have been so carelessly kept. It was not trust, not yet. It was self-interest dressed carefully as cooperation. But it was enough. What followed was the most difficult and the most transformative season of Eleanor's young life. She worked by day at Milbrook, clearing what could be cleared of the old tannery, salvaging what tools and materials had survived 4 years of neglect, teaching herself, from her father's hidden ledgers, from the memory of watching him work as a girl, the exact process he had died protecting. And she worked by evening at Ashkam Hall, piecing together, document by document, the true history of her father's ruin. It was slow, careful work, and it was made no easier by the household's evident discomfort with her presence. Mr. Reeve, in particular, grew colder toward her with each visit, and Eleanor began to suspect, though she could not yet prove, that his coldness sprang from something more than mere disapproval of a tanner's daughter walking freely through a duke's private study. She noticed, too, that certain documents she requested seemed always to have gone missing just before she asked for them, as though someone in the household were staying one careful step ahead of her search. She did not yet understand how close the danger truly was. It was not until she discovered, quite by accident, a letter in Mr. Reeve's own hand, left carelessly upon his writing desk while he attended the Duke on an errand addressed to a Mr. Pemberton, referencing the Vane matter and urging that it be settled quietly, before the girl's persistence becomes a genuine inconvenience, that she understood the full shape of the danger she had walked into. The steward who had betrayed her father had not vanished from the county at all. He had simply changed his name and his position, and had spent the last several years standing quietly at the Duke's own side, waiting to see whether the truth would ever resurface. She did not yet know his true name. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than any Milbrook winter, that the man responsible for her father's ruin was closer to her, and to the Duke, than either of them had imagined. It was a discovery she dared not share carelessly. She had learned, from 4 years of watching her family's reputation dismantled by whispers and quiet accusations, that an unproven claim against a powerful man could destroy the accuser as easily as the accused. So she did what her father, in his careful, methodical way, would have done. She began to build her case, piece by piece, letter by letter, waiting for the moment when the truth could not be denied, dismissed, or buried a second time. That moment arrived sooner than she expected, and in a manner none of them had anticipated. Autumn had turned toward winter by the time the regiment's quartermaster arrived at Ashkam Hall, seeking, on behalf of the Crown, contracts for leather goods to supply troops preparing for deployment abroad. It was, on its surface, an ordinary matter of estate business, the sort of contract that great houses like Ashkam had supplied for generations. But the timing, Eleanor understood at once, was no coincidence. Miss Reeve, or rather, the man calling himself Mr. Reeve, pressed hard for the contract to be awarded to a tannery 2 counties distant, a house with which, Eleanor would later confirm, he held a private and undisclosed financial interest. It was here that the central deception, buried for 4 years beneath grief and false debts and burned ledgers, finally connected to something Eleanor could not ignore. The same man who had destroyed her father to seize his tanning process was now positioning himself to profit a second time, using stolen knowledge, at the very moment the Crown itself required exactly what the Vane process had been designed to provide: leather strong enough, supple enough, enduring enough to serve soldiers through a hard campaign. She went to the Duke that evening with everything she had gathered: the hidden ledgers, the missing pages from his father's records, the letter urging that the Vane matter be settled quietly, and, most damning of all, an old contract she had finally located. Buried in the deepest recesses of the estate's archive, bearing the true signature of the man now calling himself Reeve, a signature that matched, exactly, the false endorsement on the debt that had ruined her father 4 years before. The Duke read it all in the same complete silence as before, but this time, when he looked up, there was no wariness left in his expression. There was something colder and far more dangerous, the particular fury of a proud man who has discovered he has been made a fool of, quietly, patiently, for years, in his own house, by a servant he had trusted without question. "You are certain," he said, and it was not truly a question. "I am certain," Eleanor answered. "Your steward destroyed my father to steal a process that was never his to take, and he has spent every year since making certain no one would ever look closely enough to notice. What happened next would be spoken of in the village for years afterward, in the particular hushed and reverent tone reserved for stories that feel, even in the telling, larger than the people who lived them. The Duke did not act rashly, though every instinct in him urged it. He was, whatever his coldness, his father's son in one crucial respect. He understood that a man exposed too quickly could simply vanish, taking his secrets and his stolen fortune with him. So instead, over the following fortnight, Eleanor and the Duke worked together, an alliance neither of them would have predicted only months before. To gather the final proofs required not merely to dismiss the false steward, but to see him formally charged before the county magistrate. It was Eleanor who suggested the final trap, that the regiment's quartermaster be permitted to believe the rival tannery's contract was proceeding as planned, drawing the false Reeve into a final careless correspondence in which he referenced, in his own hand, the very fire that had destroyed the Vane workshop 4 years prior, a detail no innocent man would have known to mention. When the truth was finally laid before the magistrate, it unfolded with the particular clean inevitability of a case built not on accusation, but on evidence too complete to dispute. The man who had called himself Mr. Reeve for 2 years was in fact one Josiah Whitfield, formerly steward to the old Duke, who had engineered the fire at Milbrook, forged the debt that destroyed Josiah Vane, and upon the old Duke's death, quietly returned to the estate under a false name to ensure the theft of the Vane process would never be traced back to him. Miss Pemberton, the solicitor, was found to have been his confederate throughout, complicit in every falsified document, every quietly buried truth. It was a scandal, in the end, though not the scandal the Duke had feared. The county did not whisper of Ashkam Hall's carelessness. It whispered, instead of the tanner's daughter who had uncovered, through patience and quiet intelligence, a deception that had fooled a Duke's own household for years, and of the Duke himself, who, to the surprise of everyone who thought they understood him, chose not to bury the matter for the sake of his own dignity, but to see it made right. The winter that followed was unlike any Eleanor Vane had known in 4 long years. The tannery at Milbrook, which the Duke himself had once declared dead beyond recovery, was rebuilt, not by charity, but by contract, formally and publicly awarded to the Vane name, with terms that honoured, at last, the partnership her father had died trying to protect. Eleanor oversaw its restoration herself, walking the rebuilt sheds with the same quiet purpose she had once walked its ruins, teaching the trade to workers who had watched her family's decline and now watched, with something like awe, its return. Her father's process, the very method Whitfield had tried to steal and could never fully replicate, for he had understood the theft of it, but never truly the craft, became once again what it had always been, the finest leather in the county. Strong enough to withstand a campaign, supple enough to be worn without complaint through the longest marches. By the time the first true snow fell that winter, the regiment, preparing for its long deployment abroad, marched in boots and belts and harness straps bearing, quietly stitched into each piece, the mark of Vane and Ashkam, a partnership finally honoured. 4 years and one great injustice too late, but honoured nonetheless. The Duke's own soldiers, the men whose safety and comfort through a hard season depended on leather that would not crack in cold or crumble in wet, wore, without most of them ever knowing it, the work of a young woman the village had once pitied as the ruined daughter of a disgraced tanner. Eleanor did not seek recognition for it, but recognition found her nonetheless, in the quiet, steady way that true respect always eventually does, not in grand declarations, but in the manner the county's better families began, slowly, to address her mother once more with the courtesy they had withdrawn 4 years before, in the way tradesmen who had once doubted her competence began, instead, to seek her counsel, in the way the Duke himself, cold and guarded as he remained in most matters, came to consult her not as a supplicant to be managed, but as a partner whose judgment he had learned, through hard experience, to trust. Of what passed between Eleanor Vane and the Duke of Ashkam in the years that followed, the village records say little. And this narration will not presume to say more than the truth allows. What can be said, with certainty, is that the ruined tannery at Milbrook, once declared dead by a man too proud and too wounded by his own losses to look closely enough to see otherwise, became in time one of the most respected houses of its trade in the county, and that its restoration was owed, in every meaningful sense, to a young woman who refused to let injustice remain buried simply because those in power found it convenient to leave it so. Her mother lived to see the family name restored, to sit once more in a parlour that was truly her own, free of debt, free of the quiet cruelty of neighbours who had once looked away. She did not live to see all that followed. But she lived long enough to see her daughter stand, unafraid, in rooms that had once dismissed her, and to understand that the strength Eleanor had shown was not something ruin had taken from her, but something it had, in the end, revealed. As for Josiah Whitfield, he was tried before the county magistrate and stripped of every position and privilege his false name had gained him. His confederate Pemberton alongside him, and the two men who had believed a dead man's ruined daughter would never think to look closely enough to see the truth learned, too late, the particular danger of underestimating patience married to intelligence. It is, perhaps, the oldest lesson in stories such as this one, and yet it is a lesson each new generation of the proud and the careless seems destined to learn only through its own hard fall. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over an English estate once its great troubles have finally passed, not the silence of neglect, but the deeper, more peaceful silence of a house finally at rest with its own history. Ashkam Hall knew that quiet again, in time. And so, in its own smaller way, did Milbrook, where the vats no longer stood empty, where the scent of curing leather drifted once more on the west wind, and where an old ruined doorway, once stood in only by grief, became instead a threshold crossed each morning by a woman who had rebuilt, with her own hands and her father's hidden knowledge, everything that injustice had once tried to take from her. It is worth remembering, as this story closes, that the Duke's dismissive words at its very beginning, that Tannery's been dead for years, were not wrong because he lied. They were wrong because he had looked at ruin and seen only its end, when in truth, ruin is so often merely the place where a different kind of beginning waits, quietly, for someone patient enough to notice it. Eleanor Vane was that patience made flesh, and by the winter her father's leather clothed the Duke's own soldiers once more. The county did not remember her as the ruined daughter of a disgraced tanner. They remembered her as the woman who proved that nothing built with true skill and honest hands is ever entirely beyond saving. Not a tannery, not a family's name, and not, in the end, even a Duke's own capacity to admit that he had been wrong. Old Tobias, the gardener, came to her at last in the spring following Whitfield's disgrace, when the danger had fully passed and there was nothing left to protect by his silence. He told her, haltingly, standing once more at the edge of the rebuilt tannery yard, of the steward who had come before Whitfield, the man in the portrait turned so long to the wall, and of how that man, too, had once tried to bury a vein, though in a smaller and gentler way, by refusing, for reasons of his own pride, to see her father properly credited for a process that had quietly enriched the estate for years before the fire. It was not the same crime as Whitfield's, Tobias said, but it was cut from the same cloth, the particular carelessness of powerful men who forget that the hands doing the work are owed more than silence for their labour. The Duke, hearing this account second-hand from Eleanor, ordered the portrait turned back to face the gallery at last, not as an honour, but as a reminder, his own words, that this house has a longer habit of forgetting its debts than I was ever taught to admit. The turning of that portrait became, in its quiet way, a kind of promise. The Duke of Ashkam was not a man given to public apology, and he did not offer Eleanor one in any form she could have repeated to her mother over supper. But in the months that followed, the estate's own records, carefully amended, this time under Eleanor's watchful eye rather than a steward's convenient discretion, began to reflect what should have been recorded truthfully from the very start. The Vane name, credited beside the Ashkam name, in every contract the Tannery fulfilled. It was a small correction in the grand accounting of the county's affairs, but Eleanor understood, better than most, that history is built from exactly such small corrections, made or withheld, and that the difference between a family remembered with respect and one erased by convenient silence is very often nothing more than whether someone, at last, was patient enough to demand the truth be written down properly. A story preserved in the quiet memory of an old English estate, carried forward not in grand monuments, but in the steady, unglamorous work of a woman who refused to let injustice have the final word. If this story stayed with you, remember to leave your thoughts in the comments below and let us know once more, before you go, where in the world you watched it from. Subscribe if you have not already, so that the next story finds you the moment it arrives, because in the quiet halls of England's old estates, there is always another letter waiting to be opened, another secret waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it.